Interpersonal communication is communication between two people. Intrapersonal communication is communication between you and yourself. Interestingly enough, we talk to ourselves in our heads through a language. And the ways in which we communicate to the world are often very similar to the ways that we communicate to ourselves inside our own heads. I often think about, how am I communicating to myself? How am I talking to myself? Am I talking to myself like a coach, like trying to encourage myself to accomplish a task? Am I talking to myself like an authority figure and somehow reprimanding my own performance? Or am I talking to myself as a therapist might, or a good friend? Oftentimes we oscillate between these different roles, but we do this on our own as individuals. And this is called with an A, intrapersonal communication. Interpersonal communication is the opposite. It's when you start talking to other people. And so, interpersonal communication, communication between at least two people. And so, the way that it works is you talk to people and then you leave the conversation and you talk to yourself. But you talk to yourself in a slightly different way based on your experiences talking to somebody else. You might think about going to the movies. Oftentimes, people go to the movies and they often go to the movies with somebody else. And when you get out of the movie theater, you often say, "So, what did you think?" And then you start talking about the movie. And so you experience a little slice of reality. It's fantastical, it's imagery, but it's also a little slice of our shared world. And so you leave the theater and you start talking to yourself or start talking to each other. When you're in the theater, you're thinking to yourself and you're talking to yourself the entire time. And so afterwards, you talk to each other, you leave that experience, and you continue to discuss the nature of the film, but now not just based on what you thought of the film in your head, but what others thought of the film as well. And so we almost always go to the movies with somebody else, and we almost always talk about the movie afterwards. I think it would be odd to go to the movies with somebody else, leave the theater, and then never discuss the movie again. Either the movie was just that bad, or the company you were with, you don't have much of an interpersonal relationship, right? And so the way this cyclical interpersonal, intrapersonal dynamic works is that as you talk to others, you go and talk to yourselves, and then ultimately we create a sustained shared meaning. And so now we have a history between two people, and we can draw back on that history and discuss the nature of reality. Luckman and Berger, two sociologists from the 1970s, referred to this as the social construction of reality. And so, intrapersonal relationships or intrapersonal communication. This often occurs in dyadic relationships developed over time with people. And so, as society moves forward and we move forward through generations, there's an old saying that every generation stands on the shoulders of the previous generation. And so, we move forward entering into a dialogue. And we are aware of what our parents said, on our elders said, and as well as our ancestors. And we view text and we contribute every time we communicate based on our shared texts and our shared worlds. We cannot talk back to movies. We might try to talk back to movies. We might yell at the screen, but ultimately, the imagery and the text do not listen to us. But what we can do is talk to each other. And so, what do? We post reviews about movies and we tell our friends, go see this movie. This is a very important movie. Or we tell people, don't go see this movie. This is a damaging movie, or this movie is just not very good. And so, we develop our own understanding of the world based on others. And so now we're moving from that intra-personal communication to interpersonal communication. But all the while, we never lose focus that we are continually talking to ourselves in a very similar way that we talk to others. We talk in a specific language. If we speak two languages, then we communicate to ourselves in two languages. We can say more words per minute and or less words per minute and per second than we can think. But still, we can only think a finite set of words per minute or per second. And so while we are talking, interpersonal communication, we are talking to ourselves, intrapersonal communication. And so there's a constitutive, meaning all parts are connected, nature of communication. As we move from the individual back to the interpersonal, and from the dyadic or the collective or the group back towards the individual. The singular moves to the whole, and the whole moves back to the singular. And so what occurs is that we create a sustained and shared meaning or a social construction of reality. And so all of us have a shared understanding of reality based on the ways other people view the world. If we ever think we see the world in one particular way and it's just us, we might have to bounce ideas off other people and see if other people feel similar or feel the same way. Now, if you take that into an interpersonal level, the relationship that you might have with one other person, then you can see that that becomes very important. One person might say the relationship is going great. I feel completely fulfilled, and I really enjoy our time together. The other person might say, every time I'm with this person, they talk about themselves, and I've never really had much of an input to lead the direction of the relationship in certain ways. And so that person might feel that the relationship is not going so great. And so, two different realities. What happens when you come together and engage in interpersonal relationships or interpersonal communication? You discuss the sustained shared meaning of the relationship, and both parties usually walk away with a much clearer notion of the shared relationship and not just the way they think that it is. And so we can extrapolate and extend that to society as a whole. So we watch the news and we look at social media and we talk to our friends and we begin to understand not only the way we see the world, but the way other people see the world. Later on, we'll look at our self concept and our self identity and how this arises from this relationship between intra and interpersonal communication. And we might ask philosophical questions like, are we more who we think we are, or are we more who other people think we are? Is our identity constructed by ourselves or by how other people view us? And so, communication is the force that sustains relational life. And if we look at society as constitutive of our communication practices, and if we look at society as relational, society, communities, we live in relational context, and you can just see how important communication is in comprising our understanding of the worlds that we live in. And so, dyadic relationship, what's a dyad? Two. right? And so when we think about interpersonal communication, we often think about dyadic relationships, your levels of communication and your relationships with one other person. We might get larger and start talking about cultural communication, or we might start talking about group communication. But dyadic relationships play a very important part in communication. So, as we've noted, communication sustains relational life. Communication might even be one of the largest factors in determining what we might refer to as reality. So, rule number one, if you are responding, and I will ask you to respond on Thursday if you are paying attention to this lecture for a particular class. Rule number one is communication is the relationship. And so I might ask a trick question: is communication important to a relationship? And you might respond, yes, it is very important. This is a lecture on communication. But I'll go even further and say that communication is the relationship. It's also the relationship that you have with yourself. So, bringing it back to that early scenario, how do you talk to yourself when you are communicating in your own mind? Are you hard on yourself? Are you compassionate? Are you inquisitive? Right. And so now think about that, how you communicate with other people. Communication is the relationship. I often recommend, if you want to have quality interpersonal relationships or just spark an interesting conversation with somebody that you don't know very well, what can we do? The answer there that I'm looking for is ask a question. If you ask a question of anybody, almost no matter what question it is, you are willing and eager to find out more about this person. And people love talking about themselves oftentimes. And so people feel good when people ask them questions, and then they get to respond. As a communicator, that's pretty easy to do because you just get to sit back and listen to the response. And oftentimes people open up in very meaningful ways. And we'll talk about disclosure, self disclosure shortly. And so communication is the relationship. How is communication the relationship to you? What does this rule mean? And these are interpersonal rules and policies, and they're, of course, informal, and all rules are meant to be broken. And so please use these and think about these in particular and unique ways. I think that's more important than just memorizing that it is a rule. And so, relational history. Let's talk about relational history. Relational history is based on prior interactions. If you meet somebody and you have a relationship and they're always talking about their problems and their issues, uh, well, then you now develop certain rules and norms that go along now with that interpersonal relationship. And you can expect that this person will talk about their issues and their problems, right? Because you have a past history of talking about one person's issues. Now, if you just walked up to somebody and met them recently, you wouldn't expect the same type of responses for somebody to talk about their personal issues to you. And so we can change the nature of our communication interactions going forward in a relationship, but we can never take them back. And so if you say something that is hurtful or damaging to people, how many times do you have to apologize to make up for that disparaging statement? How many nice things do you have to do to equalize or erase something that you wish you didn't say? It could be infinite, it could be a few, but really, no matter how many times you apologize or no matter how many nice things you do, you can never take communication back. Right? Once you say something and somebody hears it, you cannot go back and erase things. Right? So, what can you do? Pause there for a perceived audience thought and response. You could make an excuse. You could say, I had a long day that day and I wasn't in the right mood. You can apologize and you can say, I'm sorry. One of the best things to do is just own it and say, I'm understand that this affected you in a certain way, but that wasn't my intention. And ultimately, the answer is you just keep communicating. And so, oftentimes, we'll find in interpersonal relationships, and you say something that you didn't mean to say, or you say something that is hurtful to somebody. Oftentimes, people just double down over and over again and just clarify. No, let me clarify what I meant by this. And no, you're viewing it wrong. And you just double down on your original statement. And so that's just an example of how we just can communicate more. Also, we just tend to communicate more if we are in a close relationship with somebody and we've been good friends or acquaintances with somebody for a long time. Do we run out of things to say? We call our good friend, we talk to them almost every day. Do we run out of things to talk about? No, oftentimes not. Oftentimes, we just have more and more to talk about. And so we continue talking. Interestingly enough, when we meet someone brand new and someone we haven't met before, we are often at a loss to what to say. What do I talk about? But at the same time, you don't know almost anything about this person. And so there's a much larger swath of territory to cover than with your good friend that you've known for a long time. But somehow there's less to talk about with someone that you don't know. Once again, this just goes to that history that develops over dyadic relationships. Relational rules govern the relationship. And so in a society, everybody has equal say, everybody can speak, everybody has the right to voice their opinions, and everybody else has the right to speak back. And so we can never expect that we can just say anything and other people can't respond. People often ask me the question, can I say that? Should I say that? I think would be the better question. You can say whatever you want. It's protected in the Constitution. It is the First Amendment in the Constitution, right? The freedom of speech to say unpopular opinions. But recognize that everybody else also has the ability to respond to your opinions and your voices. So, by all means, state your opinions and speak up, but understand that you are entering into a relational discussion where everybody else can also respond. And so, rule number three, you cannot not communicate. Sorry for the double negative there, but you cannot not communicate. Silence. In that moment there, less than a minute, we often call it awkward silence. In our society, in Western society, we often devalue silence. We look at silence skeptically and we get worried, hence the term awkward silence. We just don't like to sit in silence with other people. Maybe it's because you cannot not communicate, and we are communicating volumes when we are silent. We are looking at nonverbal communications, facial expressions, mannerisms, body posture. We're looking at the meaning of props and dress and different cultural codes. Also, the silence itself speaks. What is this called when someone doesn't call you back? Or you text somebody and they don't text you back? Today, we might call it ghosting or the cold shoulder or the silent treatment. And so, when someone is giving you the silent treatment, or when you are giving someone else the silent treatment, or when someone just forgets to respond in any given amount of time, what happens? We start communicating to ourselves intrapersonally. And it's based on the rules that have governed our relationship in the past. Every time I text this person, they text me right back. But this time they didn't text me back And what is going on? Did I do something wrong? Do they not like me anymore? Um, what is going on? You might even go to, oh, are they in trouble? Are they okay? Still, that silence is communicating volumes. And as that silence draws out and gets longer and longer, you start communicating more and more to yourself. And so, silence can be one of the strongest ways to communicate with somebody, especially if you communicate often. And so, going back to that first rule, if communication is the relationship, and you don't communicate, what happens to the relationship? It ends, right? It terminates. If you do not communicate with somebody, then you are really not in a relationship. If you have a best friend or good friend and you haven't talked to them for a year, chances are you're still friends. You just have a lot to catch up on when you talk. But if you have a good friend that you haven't talked to for 10 years, well, then you might not be in a relationship anymore. This might not be your good friend anymore. And so the relationship might have terminated. When did it terminate? There was no specific moment that the relationship terminated, right? But it happened because you ceased to communicate. And over time, that relationship ceased to be because that silent treatment went so long that it just terminated the relationship. Role relationships develop to achieve tasks. And so we oftentimes get caught in between transactional communication. I want something to occur. How much for this stick of gum? Do people still buy gum, just sticks of gum? No, most likely not. How much for this pack of gum? Uh, this much money. Here's the money. Here's your change. Have a good day. Goodbye. More likely, more so a transactional communication, not really interpersonal communication. Interpersonal communication often refers to communication that goes past the rules that govern transactions. Still, we develop needs. I talk about my issues with one of my good friends, and so when I see them, I expect them to listen to my issues. And so we become dependent on people to achieve tasks. And this, we shouldn't forget that this is a large part of interpersonal communication, that dependence on others to get something done, whether it's just talking about your day. And so every day someone says, how was your day? And then you discuss your day. Um, you come to expect that and even be dependent upon that dynamic. But in many ways, that becomes a transactional interaction. Communication is a tool. This is where I like to say something corny like, what will you use this tool for in your life? Throughout history, communication has divided people and communication has brought people together. Some of the greatest achievements in social equality have occurred because communication was used as the primary tool. The history of communication goes back formally to the rhetorical tradition in Italy and Sicily, which at the time was a Greek colony. And early rhetoricians, notably a group of traveling teachers referred to as the sophists, devised rhetoric as a peaceful way to speak back to power and to change social situations that were oppressive. And so this is an artistic means of getting things done and achieving very specific tasks. And so every time you employ communication, you might think about it as a tool. Someone is feeling down. I might use communication as a tool and ask them to elaborate and discuss. And then I might say something positive in response or offer them context. They feel better. Afterwards, communication is used to achieve a very specific outcome. Behavioral independence. Moving towards our last rule, rule number 5. And so, behavioral independence deals with the last rule as well. And so, it coincides with mutual dependence. is this behavioral independence. We are still our own beings, accountable for our own actions. And when we enter into a relational dynamic, there's a somewhat of a tension there. Socrates and Plato call this the dialectical tension. And this dialectical tension is the foundation, I might say, unfortunately enough, of Western philosophy and Western political reality. That there will be this tension, and that somehow, and this is why I say unfortunately, Socrates and Plato noted that we come up with a universal understanding of reality. Now, it's really not universal because it's often dependent on the power dynamic and the status and the roles each person happens to be playing. And so, behavioral independence. We all get to behave and use communication in our own way. And so it becomes a tricky subject matter. We can be sarcastic, we can be ironic, we can develop a very loving relationship where we are very critical of others or even make fun of others. And you might think of some of the closest people that you have in your lives, you might talk to them in very interesting, hyperbolic, and bombastic, and even teasing ways, right? Where you poke fun at people because they're so close to you, you know that they're going to take it in a positive way. And so words are defined by people and the relationship. This is the last rule here today. Um, if I asked you the question, are the meaning of words in dictionaries or are they in people? The correct answer would be people. I might say a word, almost any word, and depending on how I want to use it in that context and depending on our relationship, will determine the meaning or definition of that word. It's cool outside. It's cold outside or chilly. That's cool, meaning that's really good, neat, or positive. Or you might say something and I say, that's cool. And I clearly don't mean that it's positive or good or chilly. I just mean like I'm kind of dismissing it and saying that's just okay. And so not very positive. And so what I mean in those various instances is not even based on the definition of the word or based on what I mean it to be in that instance, but based on the relationship. Words are defined by people. How do you define certain words? We'll get into this when we talk about semantics. Semantics is not semantics is the meaning of the word, and the word is not the territory. And because it is cool outside, it is fun inside. Right? That is not the word cool. Cool is just merely a symbol that we're using as a place marker to define the external reality. And so an argument over semantics is just an argument over words. You might have an argument, and it's all based on how you define a specific word. Some of these words are big, right? Like justice, love, freedom. Other ones a little bit smaller, like cool or good or neat. And so words are defined by people. How do you use words to describe and define external realities? So thank you very much. Slowing down here. Self-disclosure, very important. Every time we talk to somebody, we are dealing with levels of self-disclosure. As I am talking now, interpersonally, or at least perceived as interpersonally, I am interpersonally communicating to myself. Do I want to tell this story? Should I tell the story about my childhood when I used interpersonal communication or defined a word in a certain way? What about that embarrassing moment when I didn't know the meaning of a word and I used it in a wrong context? Or do I want to tell that story? And so self-disclosure, intentionally shared information about oneself. We are constantly negotiating how much we want to talk about ourselves and how much we want to share with somebody else. Now we have public information and we have more private information. Public information are really just facts we make part of our public image. I was raised in California, and I'm currently a professor on the University of at the University of Guam. And so, just public facts that are part of my public image, and one of the reasons that I am here now producing this lecture. Right? And then I have private information, and we all have private information, self concepts, right? And evaluations, whether they're good or bad, about some of the information that you share with others. Lastly, reciprocal communication and a dyadic effect. I think this is pretty interesting, and we'll end here. Remember those 5 rules. Rule number 1, communication is the relationship. Rule number 2, you cannot take communication back. Rule number 3, you cannot not communicate. Rule number 4, communication is a tool. What will we use it to achieve? And number 5, words are defined by people and the relationship. So lastly, reciprocal communication notes that we mirror each other's behavior. And we mirror the way people talk. Now, we all have our own accent. We all have our own style of speaking. We all have our own understanding of the relationship and of reality. But when we communicate with other people, we tend to communicate like they do. And so, if you're talking with somebody, or even if you're talking with a baby or an animal or a dog, you tend to communicate like they communicate. Let's all think about what kind of voice we take on when we communicate with a child, a baby. We have to not even have a name, right? It's our baby voice. We get into our high pitched, almost incomprehensible baby speak. And so we're trying to communicate like the baby, right? We don't talk like I am. And people speak generally a different language. We often tend to speak like they do, even in tone and accent, as we are attempting to communicate. Furthermore, lastly, the dyadic effect. I think this is very interesting. We match other people's levels of self disclosure. If I told you an embarrassing story about myself right now, oh, this is really funny and really embarrassing. It happened when I was 12 years old, and this is what happened. All along the while, you'll probably be thinking about some story that happened to you when you were a kid, or maybe something embarrassing that happened to you. Afterwards, you might share that story. And so, time and time again, we see a dyadic effect occur where one person shares something about themselves, and the other person feels inclined to match that level of self disclosure and share something similar. And so you can see that what we put out there in the world and to others oftentimes defines the relationship that not only that we have with one person or a group of people, but with reality as a whole. And so that interpersonal communication and that intrapersonal communication relational cycle that goes around and around continually. And as it keeps rolling, we go on through the. Thank you very much. This has been a lecture on interpersonal communication.